Hi there, my name is Kendrick, and welcome to Travel and Live Free. In this video, I'm going to talk about my country number 96 to visit every single country in the world, and that country is Nepal. After my trip to Sri Lanka and the Maldives was finished, my next destination was Nepal, and I flew with Singapore Airlines to go to Kathmandu. Our goal in Nepal is to trek the Annapurna Circuit, so we ended up leaving our stuff in a hotel in Kathmandu before heading over to Pokhara. We had a contact with our Airbnb host in Pokhara, and he helped us secure a bus going all the way to Pokhara from Kathmandu. The bus stop going to Pokhara was in the middle of nowhere, and it was quite bad because there's a lot of people trying to beg for money or trying to scam you for money. After waiting for 30 minutes, the bus eventually arrived, and it was not a pleasant bus ride. It was super hot inside, and a lot of the locals, there's no nice way to say this, but they smelled quite ripe. Eventually, they turned on the AC, which finally made the ride a little bit better than earlier. Partway through the bus ride, there was a lunch stop where the locals were to eat lunch, and I thought it was really funny because they put a rock underneath the tire to prevent it from rolling away. We did not eat lunch here because we were scared of getting food poison, so we ended up just waiting around until it was time to go. Eventually, we made it to Pokhara and met up with our Airbnb host. His name is Tupten, and after he helped us get situated, helped us with renting a sleeping bag as well as trekking poles, we went and grabbed dinner for that evening. We wanted to try dal bhat because we haven't eaten it before, so our Airbnb host recommended this Nepalese restaurant where we tried our first dal bhat ever, and I would have to say that it was just okay. The next day, we went to get our TIMS and APAC card because we need those to enter the Annapurna Circuit area. Afterwards, we went and found a taxi that can take us to Shahar, which is the launching point for Annapurna Circuit, and there was quite a lot of commotion while going there because there was an election happening at the time of traveling to Nepal. The taxi ride to Shahar was a brutal one because of the election, and the road was just really bad. It's not as bad as the bus ride to Kathmandu, but it was still bad. Some areas where the road condition was so poor, there was a backlog of traffic because vehicles couldn't go through, and locals had to put rocks over the mud just so that the vehicles can drive over them and we can go on our way to Shahar. Eventually, we made it to Shahar, where we stayed at this hotel that was just okay, and we got ready for our big day the next day, going to Chame, which is our first stop at the Annapurna Circuit. The next day, we had booked a jeep with a man named Ashok, and he loaded our stuff onto the jeep to get us ready to go to Chame. I'm pretty sure we got ripped off for the price, but you know, when you are not local, then you have to pay the tourist price. The jeep ride to Chame was actually quite fun and adventurous, and as you can see here, it was quite a nice and bumpy ride to go to there. After a long drive, we eventually found our way to our first stop, which has a very nice waterfall in the background, as well as a restaurant nearby where you can eat and view this nice waterfall while you are eating. So from there, we ordered dal bhat and some mango juice, and we just enjoyed the sights while eating our nice lunch right in front of the waterfall. While waiting before we left this place, we took some pictures, made some videos, and just chatted with other backpackers who are trekking the Annapurna Circuit at the same time as us. Before long, we were on our way again to a nice bumpy ride going to Chame, which is going to be our first stop. Before long, we arrive at our first checkpoint where they will be checking our ACAP and TIMS pass. After getting our TIMS and ACAP pass checked, we were now on the final part of the jeep ride going to Chame, which is going to be the launching point of our trek to Annapurna Circuit. When we got to Chame, we decided to head over to the accommodation that I looked up online that I thought would be a good place to stay. After scoping it out, turns out it wasn't the place that I felt would be good for us to stay, and we found another place that was a little bit more expensive but had nicer amenities that we would prefer to use for our first night in the Annapurna Circuit trek. Basically, I wanted to stay in a place that had an ensuite washroom. Even if the shower was cold, that's all what I wanted. They also had good food in this place, even though it was a little bit on the pricier side. At the very least, you can tell it was clean. After breakfast the next day, we were now off to start our Annapurna Circuit trek, starting from Chame. The trek started out relatively easy, and it was relatively flat, and it wasn't too bad at first. As we were trekking, there was a pleasant surprise when we came across Ashok again, and he greeted us before making his way back to Beshishahar. As we started trekking, our hip flexors started to hurt because we aren't accustomed to trekking for such a long time with a heavy backpack. However, thankfully, not too long after, we actually came very close to our first rest stop, which is a city called Batarang, where they have an apple orchard where you can get apples, apple pie, and various different apple juice to drink. There you go. Alright, smile.
Ta-da! I did
Yay!
it!
After relaxing in Batarang, having some apple juice and some apple chips to eat, we made our way back to the trail, and this time around we went under this very impressive underpass under a rock, which would then take us to the next spot, which is going to be a suspension bridge. Not too long after, we started hiking through this forest, and at this point we were dead exhausted. Our hip flexors were just hurting so bad, and we just couldn't wait to find a place to rest. We were also starving because at this point we haven't eaten in a while, so we were really looking forward to getting some food to eat. Thankfully, after some painful hiking, we managed to find a small town where we noticed other trekkers were also hanging out and getting lunch, so we decided to find a place ourselves and enjoy ourselves some lunch before continuing on to the final part of the trek to Upper Pisang, starting from Chame. The final push going to Upper Pisang was a really tough one. However, at the same time, I've got to say that this part of the trek has got to be the most beautiful part of the Annapurna Circuit trek in the entirety that we did it, because it was just so beautiful. We went over bridges, saw different animals, saw different landscapes, and overall it was just a pleasant hike, even though it was tough. Now, after a mad rush to get to Upper Pisang, I made my way to this tea house that I found online that said that it was a good one. Now, I try to avoid squat toilets and I try to make sure that there is an attached washroom for any accommodation that we stay at. So we did find one. It's very basic, that there is a toilet that is westernized, and yes, the shower is not included, so you do have to shower on a different part of the tea house, but that's okay. Overall, it was a good place to stay with a very nice view of the mountains. For dinner, I ate another vegetarian meal, which is a way for us to prevent food poisoning, and it was decent enough and it was very nutritious, which would help us for the following trek the next day. The next day, after seeing a nice view of the mountains bright and early, we went to eat breakfast, and after filling up, we were ready to go to hit the trail going to our next destination, which is Manang. I've got to say, the first part of this trek was super hard. I was dying. I was not having a good day. We started by going down to Lower Pisang from Upper Pisang, and at first it didn't seem too bad, but before long, we were hiking on several switchbacks, which made things very difficult. It felt like we were going on forever. However, it was just me that seems to be struggling because Karen was having a good time on the first part of this trek. And for me though, I was just dying. I feel like I probably didn't eat enough food. That's why I was dying for this first part of this morning's trek. However, luckily, after a while, we did manage to make it to the next rest stop where we were able to get some lunch to fuel us up for the next part of the trek. For lunch, I ate some potatoes, which was an awesome decision. This powered me up for that final part of the trek going to Manang. However, Karen ate some Tibetan bread and it actually sapped all her energy away. She just wanted to sleep, which made the rest of the trek very painful for her. And it was a very long trek. It was so long that I had to go find a place for her to get some hot chocolate just to power herself up for the final push to Manang.
10 spoons of sugar.
Okay, good.
My hands are shaking. I think it's cocoa powder. Water.
We were so close yet so far because the final push to Manang was still not easy. I tried to take a shortcut, but Karen was not feeling it for that shortcut, so we did split up for a bit for this section. I took the risk and I managed to get there a little bit faster, so I just waited for her at the gates of Manang. She did eventually make it there, and once we got there, it was such a wonderful feeling knowing that we are finally back in civilization. Now, Manang is one of the bigger towns in the Annapurna Circuit, and a lot of people stay here for a few days to rest and recharge, and that's exactly what we did. So we found ourselves an accommodation. It wasn't our first choice, but it wasn't bad because they still had an attached washroom with a western toilet and a shower, and overall it was a decent place to stay while we were in Manang to acclimate for the big push going up to Thorong La Paz. The next morning, we admired the mountains right behind our room, which was this beautiful glacier. And looking at it from afar, you can see how beautiful it truly is to be in this location. We also got a chance to do our laundry, which they hanged outside. We also explored the town and watched the locals do their march after the election was finished.
Wow. I missed the drummer though.
The drummer?
I missed the drummer too.
Did you?
I think he went first.
We also went to Tilicho Hotel, which was my first choice for accommodation. And there, we ate a nice lunch, which has to be the best food I ever ate during the entire Annapurna Circuit trek. Now, after eating lunch here, we went to get ourselves some pastries locally, which was also very good. And afterwards, we attended a high altitude sickness class just to learn how to prepare ourselves. After learning about altitude sickness, we decided to hire a porter to take us just to the top at Thorong La Pass because we knew that it would be very difficult for us to get there and it might not be worth it to risk our health without getting a porter. So we ended up hiring one to get us ready for the big trek to our next destination, which is going to be Ladar. Our porter decided to bring his horse with him to help carry the backpack to our next destination. He's snacking on the things. Go on, sir. We're in your home, sir. Huh?
I'm going in.
Sorry?
You want to go this way?
Oh. As you can see, after we hired our porter, Suzanne, to help us get to the top of Thorong La Pass, the trek was made so much more pleasant not having to carry that heavy backpack. It was still very hard because it was high altitude and I was still definitely very slow compared to the rest of the group. As a matter of fact, Suzanne was making fun of me saying that my girlfriend was so much faster than me, which is completely true because I am indeed a slow trekker when it comes to high altitude. Before long, we made it to a bridge, which was super cool to cross, which will take us to our first rest stop on our way to Ladar.
Hello.
Hi.
After crossing the bridge, we now started trekking towards Yak Kharka, which is going to be our first rest stop on our way to Ladar. A lot of people go to Yak Kharka for their place to stay overnight. However, we decided to go to Ladar, which is a little bit higher in altitude, but it would give us a head start the following day on our trek towards high camp. So we thought it would be a good decision to do that. On our way there, while we were trekking towards Yak Kharka, we did see some eagles, which was super cool. Before long, we made it to Yak Kharka, where we filled ourselves up with water, and after getting some water, we went to find a restaurant to stop by and get some tea. We decided not to eat lunch here because Ladar is not too far from Yak Kharka, so we would just eat lunch once we get to our accommodation. But we did stop for tea, which was very pleasant, before continuing on to our journey towards Ladar. The push from Yak Kharka to Ladar wasn't too bad at all. There was just like one epic bridge, and before long, we made it to Ladar. And once we get to Ladar, we were given some options for accommodation to stay. The first one had no private toilet, so we decided to find one that had a private toilet attached to our room. Even though it was squat, I still took it because having a private toilet is better than having a public one, and that extra privacy is always a nice bonus. We had plenty of time to relax in our room before grabbing dinner and hanging out with other trekkers. I also noticed I was the only one that took a bath using those buckets where you put the water over your head. And overall, it was a good time to recharge ourselves before the big push to high camp the next day. The next day, we are going to be trekking from Ladar all the way to high camp. At first, we were debating if we should stay in Thorong PD instead. However, as we were trekking, we realized that we still had energy left to might as well give it a big push to high camp. That way, the trek to Thorong La Pass will not be as long. At the same time, that same day, our horse also ran away and ran back home, so Suzanne ended up having to carry both our backpacks towards Thorong La Pass. Ironically, even when Suzanne was carrying both our backpacks, he was still trekking a lot faster than me and Karen, just to show how fast these Nepalese people and how strong they really are compared to the rest of the people on planet Earth. Another funny thing that happened during the trek towards Thorong PD is that People kept thinking that I am a Nepalese vendor because at this point my skin was tanned. I was wearing the kind of jackets that the Nepalese people would wear, and there was one instance I was sitting in this one rest stop where some Spanish people went up to me and asked me how much the goods were, and I told them, no, I don't work here, I'm also a trekker, and they were so embarrassed. It was so funny. Another thing that you'll notice during the trek from Ladar to Thorong Pidi is that vegetation starts to disappear from here on out. It starts to get sparse and more sparse the further we go. We eventually get to an area called the landslide area, and this part was a little bit scary because at any time a landslide could happen. Despite being in high altitude, I was taking Dimox, which is a high altitude pill which helps you acclimate faster. The only downside is that you do pee quite a lot more, and it does create some stomach aches, which I'll explain more later on when I did get a massive stomach ache near the end of my trek. Now, for the final push towards Thorong Pidi, it wasn't as bad as I thought, which was good, and it gave me the motivation and hope that I can in fact make it to high camp, and that's when we made the final decision that we would stay at high camp. Eventually, we made it to Thorong Pidi, and from here we took a nice long break just to get some food to eat, use the toilet, load up on water, and just to plan on how we were gonna tackle going up to high camp, which is our next destination, and also the last stop and the last night that we would stay high up in high altitude before going over to Thorong La Pass and heading back down to Muktinath. The final push from Thorong Pidi to high camp was very brutal. Normally people take 2 hours to get there, and the fast people can do it in 1 hour, and it took me about an hour and a half to do it. It was really hard, I was out of breath, it was super steep, and you are climbing up at a high grade of elevation and steepness in a very short amount of time. So it was definitely not easy. The altitude was definitely starting to get to me. My head wasn't having a headache yet, but it was starting to pound, so that told me I was very close to having a headache. After getting to high camp, me and Karen decided not to rest yet because there is a viewpoint just above high camp that is supposed to be one of the most beautiful viewpoint in the whole Annapurna Circuit trek. So we decided to push through anyways, even though I was dead tired, I was dying, but I knew that if we started to rest, I would not want to do it later on. So we pushed through, and my god, it was definitely 100% worth it. It was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, and the view was just out of this world. As you can tell, there was no more vegetation at this high altitude, but at the same time, it was still so very much beautiful. And there was people up there that was also enjoying the view. And I would say that if you do the Annapurna Circuit trek, don't miss the viewpoint just above high camp because it's totally worth it. After getting down, we got ourselves situated in a room, and the first thing I did was scope out the washroom because I heard the washroom has a very disgusting squat toilet, but it wasn't as bad as I thought. We then ate a very hearty dinner just to make sure we are nice and fueled up for the big day tomorrow. I decided not to eat breakfast the next day, which would haunt me later on because I would not have a lot of energy left for the trek itself. But I was also having digestion issues at this point, so I wanted to spare myself more stomach ache by just not eating breakfast the next day. After waking up at 4 a.m., we began the trek at 5 a.m. and it was quite dark when we started. I decided to skip breakfast this morning because I didn't want to get any stomach aches, which turned out to be a bad decision. As the trek went on, the weather was getting increasingly cold the higher elevation that we got. We also got to see a cool bridge that we crossed over, and as we were going along, more and more people started coming out of the woodwork to also finish up the trek towards Thorong La Pass. It was kind of crazy because on our trek up, there wasn't that many people, but now that we are trekking towards Thorong La Pass, suddenly there were so many people on the trail. The only good thing that I noticed during this trek towards Thorong La Pass was at the very least, the high altitude sickness did not get me. My head felt like it started to pound, however, there was no headache, which was a great news. This is gonna sound like too much information, but at one point during the trek, my stomach was hurting so bad that I had to go find a corner to go do my business. Like I said, too much information, but this is the reality of trekking the Annapurna Circuit at times. At one point, we did lose our porter, Suzanne, because he was trekking so fast. Even though he was carrying both our backpacks, he was still speeding up so much faster that Karen and me can get up towards Thorong La Pass. At some point during the trek, we did get lost, and luckily we did find Suzanne, who helped us find our way to the final push to the top. After a hard trek, we made it to the top, and you can hear people celebrating.
I know you're nervous.
Look at those clouds, amazing.
There was also an overpriced shop at the top that was selling tea. And of course, with no other competition, everyone happily paid their money to get some hot tea before descending down Thorong La Pass. We paid Suzanne the second half of the amount of money that he was charging us to porter our bags to Thorong La Pass. We had already paid him the first half of the money before leaving Manang earlier. And from there, we took a picture and said goodbye to him before heading down towards Muktinath. The last part of the trek was a brutal one. It started out relatively easy as we were descending down from Thorong La Pass, making our way down to Muktinath. It didn't seem too bad and the view was spectacular, so we thought, hey, this is not going to be so bad after all. The first problem hit us when we realized that we were extremely low on energy, and we managed to scarf down whatever food we have left, which is pretty much a Reese's peanut butter cup, as well as a few candies and cookies. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough, and before long, we were starving to death again and feeling hopeless as we were descending down in this never-ending trek down the mountain. The sun was also blaring down at us, so on top of being hungry, it was starting to get quite hot as well as we were descending down the mountain. Karen actually got a mental breakdown during this trek because it was so hard and she was just dying, and I don't blame her. It was actually very brutal. We did find a place to eat to fill our stomachs and replenish our spirits before continuing down towards the trek towards Muktinath. So close yet so far, because after we got out of that little village that had restaurants, there was still quite some time away before we can reach Muktinath, and this included crossing a long bridge. At this point, again, we were dead exhausted. Our feet was killing us after trekking all day already. Thankfully, crossing this bridge was actually pretty cool, and the one thing that I realized was that right after we crossed the bridge, we actually weren't very far from Muktinath. I encouraged Karen to push through because before long we saw the sign to Muktinath. After over 11 hours of trekking up to Thorong La Pass and down towards Muktinath, we finally see Muktinath right in front of us, and I'd love to say that we were jumping up and down in joy after we got here, but that's not actually what happened because we were way too dead tired to celebrate. So at this point, we were just desperate to look for a place where we can rest. After entering Muktinath, the first thing that I wanted to do was look for a place that had a van or some sort of vehicle that can take us to Jomsom, which is going to be our final destination in the Annapurna Circuit. From there, we would be taking a plane to go back to Pokhara and thus ending our adventure in the Annapurna Circuit. We didn't have to search too long because before you know it, we managed to find a company that can take us all the way to Jomsom in a van. The van ride was actually pretty neat, and there was a town called Kathmandu that we drove by, and I kind of wish we ended our Annapurna Circuit trek there because it was such a beautiful place. Before long, we made it to Jomsom and we went to the airline office, purchased ourselves a ticket, and we were now ready to go back to Pokhara. We spent the night at a local hotel that was quite overpriced, but at the very least they had hot showers and a warm bed, as well as some clean protein to eat. After eating vegetarian for a week, I definitely miss eating meat. My stomach also felt messed up at this point after taking the altitude sickness medicine to finish up the trek without getting a massive headache. The next day, we went to the airport and got ready to board our flight. There was a security checkpoint where they do check all your belongings before boarding the plane, and there was quite a lot of Indian people also in this area. I think they were either going on vacation or had some religious festivities that they were partaking in before heading back to Pokhara. They went ahead and checked our boarding pass, and while we were lining up, I actually befriended a really friendly Indian man who you can see here right in front of me, and he was super friendly, telling us stories of India as well as Nepal, and kind of explained to us what the boarding process is like for the small airplane that flies between Pokhara and Jomsom. The boarding process is pretty cool. I've never flown in one of these small airplanes before. However, a few weeks after flying back to Canada, one of these planes did crash up in the mountains, which is kind of scary if you think about it, because I was on the exact same plane that flew back to Pokhara. Before long, we were on our way towards our airplane to board, and we were gonna get ready to fly back to Pokhara and end our trip to the Annapurna Circuit. The flight was very short but neat at the same time because we can see different towns along the Annapurna Circuit. And before long, we were now landing in Pokhara, which is a very beautiful city. After heading back to Pokhara, we took a taxi back to Thupten's place, the Airbnb we were staying at. He got us a nice, delicious Tibetan breakfast ready with my favorite Tibetan bread. We did spend some time in Pokhara to rest and relax, and also to eat a lot of food that has a lot of probiotics such as kimchi and miso, just because my stomach was not feeling good and I was trying to rehab it by eating a lot of food that has a lot of probiotics. We also did a little bit of sightseeing before deciding to fly back to Kathmandu and finish our trip in Pokhara. Thupten gave us a scarf as a gift from Nepal and took us to the airport, where we got ourselves ready to board and head back to Kathmandu. The flight back to Kathmandu was relatively painless and quick, and before long we were now back in the capital city of Nepal. It was very nice to go back to civilization and stay in a hotel and eat westernized food again. We ate at local restaurants just to enjoy local food. I also ate my final dal bhat in Kathmandu, and I will never eat it again because I now hate dal bhat and I'm so sick of it. We also watched Doctor Strange 2 here in Kathmandu since they filmed Doctor Strange 1 in Kathmandu. The last tourist attraction that we saw in Kathmandu was the monkey temple, and Karen was disappointed at first because there wasn't very much monkeys, but later on all the monkeys came out of nowhere and there were so many of them, hordes and hordes of them actually, which left Karen feeling satisfied to end our trip in Kathmandu. After taking one last walk around Kathmandu, eating lots of Japanese food and some of the most delicious Korean food I've ever eaten, we got an antigen test done before heading to the airport, ate some burgers, and now we were heading back to Canada. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that video of my travels to Nepal. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave your comments below, and don't forget to sign up to our Travel and Live free newsletter, where you can get a 10-step cheat sheet on how to travel around the world. You'll also get the latest tips, strategies on how to save money on travel for Canadians, how to go on a around the world adventure travel for Canadians, and how to use travel to get more freedom in your life as a Canadian. You can sign up for that newsletter in the description below. Until next time, I'll see you then.